I'm going to start with an introduction to what am I even talking about with effective altruism, and then we'll kind of go into the topic of what does this have to do with one's own life later on. And then we'll have the second half of class for questions. So obviously a lot of people want to do good. Why this effective altruism movement in particular? It's a group of people who are excited about not just doing some good, but trying to be picky and find the opportunities for doing the most good. And to do that, we use a scientific approach, so using evidence and reason to try and find those best opportunities. And then, despite our origins with a lot of philosophers who are extremely good at talking rather than taking action, we do try to put this into action, live our values, and try and use that evidence to inform what we actually do rather than just talk about. So I'm going to give a few examples of kind of the beginnings of effective altruism that sort of illustrate where this comes from or what kinds of actions people may be taking. And one of these examples is from research done by the likes of JPAL, the Poverty Action Lab at MIT. Its sister organization is Innovations for Poverty Action, based here. And these were two organizations doing a kind of research that was fairly new to apply to the field of sort of global poverty or global development. And this was using randomized controlled trials, which were borrowed from medicine. So if you want to know, say, if a new treatment works, you might have two populations of patients, randomly put them into different groups, and give some of them the treatment, others not, and that allows you to see what effect this treatment actually has. Which can otherwise be kind of hard to tell. So in the field of development or anything to do with economics, it's often extremely hard to tell what effect some kind of change actually has. And so these researchers were trying to figure out, they'd seen a lot of development projects that had gone poorly. I'm sure you've heard horror stories about sort of well-intentioned but ill-fated projects that were meant to help people and in fact either weren't very helpful or even caused harm. So they were trying to do research that would let them know more about what the effects of various interventions were. And so some of the research that they did was on education and what would increase school attendance. So in many parts of the world, this is a major problem that children aren't spending very much time in school. Obviously, this isn't the only thing that you care about in education, but it's one of the sort of first things that needs to happen before learning can happen. And these were they did find some interventions that didn't really have any noticeable effect at all or any like statistically significant effect. But these were some of the interventions that did seem to have some measurable effect. So I'd like you to, as I'm describing these, just take a bit and think about which one you think might have had the most effect. So one was providing free school uniforms. One was conditional cash transfers for girls, so essentially giving families money to keep their daughters in school. One was having info sessions for parents about how much more their children might earn if they complete certain levels of schooling. And one was providing merit scholarships for girls. So we'll do a show of hands. If you spend a given amount of money, which of these interventions do you think does the most to sort of increase the amount of time that children spend in school? So hands if you think it's the school uniforms. Okay, we have some for uniforms. The cash transfers. Okay, that's a popular one. The info sessions for parents. Okay, and the merit scholarships. Okay, so there's a variety of guesses out there. I myself, when I first saw this evidence presented, had no idea which of these would be most effective. We can think of reasons why they all might work, and they do all work. But as far as which one works the best, it's just hard to know without doing research or seeing what the results are. So 3 of these, this is how they compare. The cash transfers provide about a month of extra education this is all per $100 spent. So if you spend $100 on this program, you expect to get roughly 1 month of additional schooling. The merit scholarships do about twice as well. The free uniforms do about 7 times as well. So providing almost a year of extra schooling. And the info sessions for parents blow them all away. So this was a program that the researchers weren't sure how well it would work because the parents themselves often were not literate or numerate. So doing essentially a statistical presentation on how much children might earn after certain levels of education wasn't something that the researchers were sure would work at all. And yet, obviously, the parents were able to understand, and this sort of changed the family's prioritization of sending the children to school. So the reason that we want to think about how much result do you get for $100 is that none of us as individuals, no foundation, no government, no charity, has all the resources that it would like in terms of money or staffing or time to address all the problems that it would like to. And so a big focus in effective altruism is thinking about, we have limited resources, so where can we put them that will do the most? And this kind of evidence, I think this is an especially stark example, and it's, you know, an oversimplification. It's one aspect of what do we care about in education, or what changes might help this particular field, and you can tell me in the Q&A about how it's an overly simplistic example. But I think this shows the kind of thing that effective altruism is trying to look at, is that if some things you can put your resources towards have a lot more impact than others, then it really matters that you get the information to do those comparisons and try to find your best options. To give another example of this kind of approach from kind of the earlier days of effective altruism, these are two guys who were working at a hedge fund in New York. This is Eli Hassenfeld and Holden Karnofsky. And they were coworkers there, and they and their other coworkers were making a ton of money, and they wanted to donate some of it to charity. And so they decided to kind of take on this project of figuring out what were the best charities to donate to in a couple different fields. So they were looking at things like US education, global health, global education, maybe a few others that I'm forgetting. So first they found that using the kind of approach that they were used to, where they're essentially trying to find investments that are the best choice, or that will provide the best return, they're trying to do that essentially for charities. Like, if you put your money into this charity, what do you expect to result? What will the impact be of your money? And they were surprised at how hard it was to do this research, in one part because the charities weren't used to having donors ask for this kind of thing. I actually worked at one of the charities that they approached during the early days in like customer service, and I got an email from them, and I brought it to like my boss's boss and asked, like, oh, there's this charity evaluator, they're new, and they're trying to get data about our effectiveness. Do we have data we can send them? And the person I worked for said, we've never heard of them, like they're nobody. We're not gonna spend time on this kind of request. And they got a lot of that in the early days. They found that not a lot of donors were asking for this kind of information. Donors are accustomed to giving based on personal connections to a charity, maybe the sort of feeling that it gives you, or the image that it presents. But there really wasn't a lot in the way of kind of like consumer reports for charities. There were some readings that would tell you sort of, were they spending like too high a proportion of their money on overhead expenses, but they couldn't really answer the question of what will the charity actually accomplish with your money. So they found this was a harder problem than they expected. They also found that they were way more into it than they expected. So Ellie, I think, got particularly into the question of diarrheal disease and stayed up late nights like researching diarrheal disease and what could be done to treat it and how cost effective it was. So eventually they quit their jobs at the hedge fund, and they founded GiveWell, which is a charity evaluator that tries to find sort of a short list of the most evidence-backed sort of best bets in global health and development charities. And then that's using this very sort of evidence-based, like what do the randomized trials show us kind of approach. But obviously not all interventions can really be measured with a trial like that. So they also kind of branched off into looking at things like policy changes or other like weirder stuff that's harder to measure. So Holden kind of spun off the Open Philanthropy Project is the last word of that. And that sort of is trying to carry out that same type of finding best bets, but with stuff that's harder to measure. So these questions of what's the best bet within a field apply not just within a given area, but we try and apply them to larger areas as well. So what do you even look for in a cause? And I think a lot of us are used to comparing, like, okay, if you want to give to, say, climate change charities, maybe you're comparing climate change charities to each other, but how do you even pick that area? And we think that there's a lot to be gained, not just from comparing like interventions within a field or charities within a field, but also comparing whole fields to each other. How do you find the most impactful fields in the first place? And we tend to use this sort of three-part framework or three questions to try and compare different areas to each other. So one is, what's the scale? How many people are affected? How badly are they affected? So for example, it would be good to cure a rare disease, but it would be even better to cure a common disease because more people would benefit from that. How crowded is the area, or how neglected is it? Are there already a lot of resources going to this? Are a lot of people already working in the field? Is it already getting a lot of money? Or is it relatively ignored compared to how important it is? This is an area where I think like media coverage can lead us astray, because we often see a lot of media coverage of areas that are unusual or noteworthy because they are new. Things that are new and unusual get more attention in the media, where things that are ongoing problems may get relatively little attention because they are not novel, even though the fact that they are happening all the time is exactly what makes them so important, because they affect so many people every day. So a lot of public health problems, I would say, are in this category where nobody is covering, say, the lack of clean water as like a new thing, and yet it affects a large part of the world's population all the time. Whereas something like a lightning strike or a terrorist attack or something like that, even if it affects relatively few people, often gets a lot more attention. And then the last question is, how easy is it to make progress? How tractable is this problem? Some problems are just much harder to address or to make progress on than others. And one question is, are we even able to do something about this? So some problems like, say, preventing war, very important, would affect large numbers of lives, and yet hard to know what exactly we should do to address that. So some of the areas that effective altruists tend to kind of focus on based on those kinds of considerations, the one that I've been kind of focusing on and that most of my examples are from global health and development. A lot of early EA work happened in this area. It does affect a large number of people. It is fairly tractable. There's a lot of evidence about what kinds of things work here. So for example, there are 6 million child deaths each year that could be easily prevented. So these are from things like malaria, which could be prevented with nets, unsafe water causing diarrheal disease, things like this, which we know how to prevent, and in richer countries we do prevent almost all of these deaths, and yet the resources haven't really been rolled out to preventing all of these. Animal suffering is larger in scale. If you think that animals matter morally or have like experiences, then there are a lot of them. There are 60 billion farm animals raised each year, many in horrifying conditions. So if you think that they matter, and if it's possible to, say, improve farming conditions or reduce the number of animals that are farmed, then that would affect a lot of lives. And then another area that people in effective altruism tend to focus on is risk to humanity in general, things that could maybe wipe out our whole future as a species. So things like nuclear war, like problems with artificial intelligence, or pandemics, either natural or engineered. And this one scales very high on importance. Obviously, like the future of our species affects a lot of lives. It's lower on how easy is it to make progress. Preventing a pandemic obviously is like a really hard problem compared to something like preventing malaria, which we actually know how to do pretty well. So some ways that people in effective altruism take action. As I said, we're trying not just to do research, but to actually personally take action. A lot of EAs make career choices that try to put these values into action. So some of the fields that you might choose would be some kind of direct work. So directly maybe doing research on a problem, maybe working at some kind of nonprofit or agency that tries to address a problem. You might work in policy to try and redirect resources or policies to be a little saner or more directed at kind of evidence-based policies. A lot of foundation funding is not especially evidence-based, so if you could influence funding, either say in a government or a foundation, that could make a big difference. What we call earning to give is essentially trying to get a higher earning career so that you can donate to work done by other people, essentially. And trying to affect opinion, so maybe calling attention to some of these underknown areas or neglected areas, for example, in journalism. And the second way that a lot of people in effective altruism try and take action is through donation. This is kind of how I came into EA. I'll say more about that later. And the main kind of body that's trying to sort of support people from effective altruism in giving is called Giving What We Can. We've just marked 10 years since this sort of organization was founded. And it's a group of people that have pledged to donate at least 10% of our incomes over the course of our careers to the most effective charities that we can find. And there are now, I think, something like 4,500 people who have taken that pledge. Starting from 10 years ago, when it was kind of like one guy with this idea and maybe some of his friends would join him, we've been kind of surprised that actually like thousands of people want to make this commitment. And one of the reasons that we think donation can be really effective as part of a lot of people's lives, not just for the very rich, is this whole question of like who is rich, what constitutes being rich. And when you look at world income distribution, this is about 10 years out of date, but the same pattern essentially holds now. If you line everyone up by how much they earn, so with the people who earn the least over on that far end at 0%, and then the 100th percentile is actually kind of truncated at the top because it would go through the ceiling if it kept going past 100K. This is the kind of distribution you see. So the median person at the 50th percent, you can see, is earning like a few $1,000s a year. So this is like per person. And it's in dollars that are already adjusted to the fact that money goes farther in some economies than others. So you're probably familiar with, if you take US dollars, in some areas or countries you can buy more with them. This is already adjusted to be in sort of standardized US dollars. So if the typical person in the world is earning much less than us, this is sort of what that looks like concretely. The US median income per person is around $30,000, which puts you at about 94th percentile, so earning more or having higher income than about 94% of the world. And then obviously, if you expect to earn more than median income, then you'll be even richer than most of the world. So I think for me, certainly, and for a lot of members of Giving What We Can, looking at this kind of fact about what income is worldwide makes pretty clear that we do, in fact, have more than we strictly need, and that we have options for what we do with that sort of extra, and that there are a lot of things you can do, and one thing that you can do is try and donate to make the world a fairer and better place, in your view. And that will mean different things to different people, and people will make different decisions about what they think is most effective or most needed. But this is a group of people trying to kind of support each other in carrying that out as a regular part of our lives. So, as I said, my background in this area, or my interest in this area, kind of comes from donation. As a child and a teenager, I was interested in the question of, I knew that the world was unfair. My parents had sort of taught me and my sister that, we had privilege and that we were lucky to be living in the United States and to, have parents who had good jobs and to have good free education and to have more money than we needed. And I thought, I understood those points. But then I kind of took it a little further than they wanted and was saying, well, maybe we should redistribute our income. If it's so unfair and we're so privileged, maybe we should be giving it away to people who have a lot less. And they were less keen on that idea. They wanted me to be sort of grateful, but not end up destitute, which they were pretty worried about there for a while. But So my goal was to kind of try and spend as little as possible of my allowance or when I got a job to be able to donate more. And essentially out of this idea of redistributing what I had. And I didn't really meet anyone for a long time who was into that idea or wanted, some people thought it was sort of interesting, but not something that they personally wanted to participate in. And in college, I met my now husband, and I kind of explained, I have this sort of weird policy, and I'm going to try and give away as much of my money as I can. So he was like, yeah, well, maybe we'll have separate budgets then. And so that was the plan for a while. And then after hanging out with me for a while, he kind of started to come around to this idea of oh, maybe we do actually have a responsibility to make the world a bit less messed up by giving some of what we have to people who have very little for basic needs. And so once he was kind of sold on that idea, we decided our first year that we had sort of finished college and had real jobs. I was doing customer service at the charity where we turned down GiveWell's request, and he was doing computer programming. And we decided we were going to try and donate 50% of our income that following year. And we didn't make our goal because we forgot that you have to pay taxes every year. We had neglected to think about that one. But we did sort of make it up the following year. And we took 1 year off when I was in grad school, but other than that, we've donated between 30 and 50% of our incomes every year since then. And that's gotten easier over time. It used to be more of a stretch, but he has continued to work in computer programming, and because that industry is doing well, we have way more money than we need, essentially. And we think, on the one hand, we're still very lucky, and even on, say, he works at Google, and half of a Google salary is still way more than US median income and way, way more than typical world income. So we felt that this is very doable for us, and it's meant that we can give significant amounts of money to things that we think are making a real difference in the world. The sort of evidence-based piece that I described at the beginning was new to me. So when we started meeting other people who were kind of interested in these ideas, it became clear to me that my level of research, which was basically an evening of Googling, was not the best that one could do, and that there were people like GiveWell who were doing actual real research about this topic, and that there were a lot of open questions about where are the best places or the most impactful places that you could donate. So our giving has definitely sort of evolved around that. We've also, I think, for me, thinking in terms of not just how do I spend less, but what if we could earn more? When Jeff first proposed that idea to me, I was pretty horrified, because I thought of trying to earn more money as something that you only did if you were greedy, because that was the sort of hippie ethos that I was raised with. But it did actually make sense. I went into social work, which is not the world's highest paying career, but it was better than being a charity admin assistant. And then ended up working at the Center for Effective Altruism when they sort of wanted someone to do community work in this sort of growing effective altruism community. And they had been kind of encouraging everyone to go into finance and these high earning careers so they could donate. And then they were like, oh no, we need someone who knows how to deal with people. And we've got all these bankers here, but Julia, could you come do some community work? So that's how I ended up in this job. And at this point, I'm also the president of Giving What We Can, which is a project of the Center for Effective Altruism, where I work. These are our kids. We've done some pretty normal stuff, like buying a house and having kids. I think they're great. It's totally possible, again, on a sort of white-collar salary, to give away significant amounts of money and still have plenty of money to have normal stuff that is important. And by stuff, I mean childcare, which is way more expensive than almost any of the stuff we own except our house. This is something they don't tell you They're like, oh yeah, save for college. You think of college as the expensive part about having children. Secret, it's childcare. That's the really expensive part that happens way sooner than college. But we're able to make it work, obviously. This is what our budget looks like. This is a couple years old, but it's basically the same. So that blue half is donations. We do pay taxes every year, as we forgot about the first time. We did pay them the first year. We just forgot that we were going to have to pay them. Childcare, housing, savings, other stuff like food. We have made some choices about, say, living closer to the subway, which is more expensive, but not owning a car, which has saved quite a bit of money. We bought a house, which is expensive, but we have always shared it with housemates, which does help you save money. I think college is a great time to think about what kind of consumption is actually important to your happiness, because the natural thing to do is, as you get more money, then you spend more money. And there are lots of things that will want to tell you how you can spend this money. And if you're not sort of thinking in advance, that's just a very easy track to kind of do without thinking. And I think thinking about what is it that actually is important to your happiness, and the evidence sort of emphasizes that some of it is your personality that you can't do a whole lot to change. Some of it is things like your health, and a lot of it is your personal connections with friends and family. People who have close friendships and close relationships with family, are sort of statistically quite a bit more happy. And that has those three things have a much stronger impact on your happiness than does income, at least after a certain point. I think if you're being actually poor, it's quite unpleasant and stressful. But if you're past a point of income, then it doesn't do a lot to impact your happiness, at least statistically. So we've tried to really prioritize things like living close to Jeff's extended family, spending time with friends, living with housemates because that's a good way to see people instead of being isolated in your house, and having children. So, and then some of the other stuff we have not spent money on, so we don't spend a lot on travel or cars or whatever the other things are that people spend money on. So that, I guess my pitch for why you might want to get involved in the EA community. I think, this class is sort of about what is a good life, what is meaningful, what makes life sort of satisfying, or I think there's a lot of that to be had in effective altruism. I think being around people, which is sort of my second point, being around people who care about the state of the world and are really trying to do something about it and learn about it. There are a lot of hard and interesting questions. It means that after you finish college, I think it's pretty easy to kind of just fall into work and family life and not really have much going on beyond that. But I think it's kind of helped keep me open about wow, the world is complicated and there are all these hard questions that I feel I'm part of working on. And so a sense of meaningful work to do and a community of really caring and interesting people to do that work with. I would recommend it. And one way that you can get more involved is effectivealtruism.org, which will let you get the newsletter and so forth and read more about what this is about. And then I think Josh is going to tell you a bit more. Do you want to do that after the Q&A? About the Effective Altruism group at Yale. So, that's it. We'll go to questions now.
I'm wondering how effective altruism tends to think about areas of altruism that are a lot harder to quantify, a lot harder to measure, such as the arts.
Yeah, I think almost all of the areas where you could do are kind of hard to quantify and hard to measure. I think the arts is one where a lot of people in EA have a personal interest in that and participate in the arts. So my husband plays in a band, for example, but don't tend to prioritize it as a way to improve the world. And I tend to think of that in terms of like say with my own children, if one of them needed medical care and also I could give her like arts lessons or some kind of class or something like that, like I know what I would prioritize. And on a worldwide scale, I think it's pretty clear that there are pressing needs that I would prioritize before I would prioritize like spending on the arts. I think also when we say the arts is a charitable thing, we mean arts that are expensive enough that people don't pay for them themselves, like large productions of the types of arts that like cost a lot of money to produce. Whereas like there's a ton of art in every culture in the world. There's music, there's storytelling, there's dance. People participate in the arts, but often in cheap ways. And I think rather than prioritizing paying for more expensive forms of art, I would prioritize like other fields first. And I think most EAs think that way. Yep.
Could you talk about effective altruism, like the importance that it places on family in comparison to strangers?
Yeah, so I think it's not trying to answer the question of how should you personally allocate your resources between, say, your family or your own well-being and charity or other people's well-being, basically. I think the closest we get is things like saying, if you're not sacrificing anything of comparable importance, then you should probably help people who need it. So the sort of classic example is Peter Singer's example of if you're walking by a pond and you see a small child drowning, and you could jump in, but it'll ruin your clothes and maybe your cell phone, but you would save the child's life. Most people would say you should do it. And that like losing your cell phone or having to buy a new cell phone is not of comparable importance to saving that life. Whereas if it were something like you're walking with your child and you have to like leave them unattended near the pond or what, I don't know, you could imagine trade-offs where it is something genuinely important, such as the well-being of your family, that you're trading off. And I think that's just a really hard question. And I think people, and even your own well-being, do you pursue a career maybe that you enjoy less than the one that you intended to? I think there are people who, there are hard questions around that. I think some of it may have more impact, like I think self-sacrifice may have more impact in the shorter term, but I think that especially young people who are used to thinking in the scale of a few years should be thinking about the longer term impact and things like if you do damage relationships with your family or you do go into a career that you don't actually enjoy, will you be able to keep that up? Is this something you're going to feel good about in a few years' time? Will other people want to participate in this, or will they see that you're miserable and think this is like not something they want to be part of? I think it gets complicated, and EA doesn't really have answers to the question of how should you make those trade-offs, and you'll find people making them in different ways. Did I see one over there? You've got.
Yeah, thank you for that. I really respect your commitment to service. I would love to hear more about this for remote you can. Especially, I'm very concerned by the push to move people towards finance and even to work in things like big tech so that you can donate. I worked at a bank this summer and saw myself how exploitative the practices were, and I'm not convinced that altruism is taking from some communities that you can choose which ones you give to later. So I would just like to hear what that says more about your timeline for altruism and how you justify that, especially given wage inequality in the US and globally.
Yeah, so this has been an ongoing sort of topic of debate, and I think there are some careers that I think really nobody in effective altruism thinks are worth taking, and the organization within EA that does career advising is called 80,000 hours, which is the number of hours that you would work in a typical career, and they have a list of like careers that they think are so harmful that no one should take them in order to have altruistic impact. So that's things like working for, I forget, like weapons companies and big tobacco and maybe some types of financial services. I think the type of, I think there are a lot of different niches within finance and within tech, and that, so for example, a lot of the EAs who work in finance tend to work in quant trading, which is basically making money from other quant traders. Like the people that the money is being exchanged between are all very rich, as opposed to some other forms of banking or finance, which have like a more clearly harmful impact on other people who are not themselves like rich bankers. I think, again, this is kind of an individual decision, and people make different calls about whether, say, to work for a big company whose values they don't necessarily like feel great about. There's an argument that I find fairly persuasive and others have found fairly persuasive. It's a blog post, I think by 80,000 Hours, called Show Me the Harm, about essentially the number of people dying all the time from preventable causes and the amount that you could earn in these fields, and doing the math on if you were able to like prevent all the preventable deaths, say, that would be like actually a small fraction of some of these industries, and which of those would you value more? I think it's also, if you're coming from a sort of anti-capitalist view of like, if these big tech companies didn't exist, like, would that be better? Would that improve wage inequality? Is inequality itself the problem, or is like low wages period the problem? I think there's like a bunch of complicated like economic sort of questions to get into there. And there's debate about it, and I don't have a firm answer.
I appreciate that a lot. I would just encourage you to think about the broader ecosystem of how even a bank having quant traders has to get money from somewhere. I have read a lot about effective altruism and just would love to continue learning and thinking about these issues.
I think one concept that's key to this and to some other stuff, especially in career choice, is sort of the idea of if you don't do this, what will happen? And that's used both for things like if you, like one EA who became a doctor in order to save lives, because that's why like a lot of people are interested in medicine, was like, well, what would happen if I don't become a doctor? Well, someone else who's very similar to me will get into medical school. In the UK, where he lives, we'll still have the same number of doctors. So it would take like quite a lot of EAs, say, not going into medicine or not going into quant trading or not going into any field before it has like any noticeable impact on how that field functions or how well that company is doing or how well that field is doing. I think that as EA grows, maybe it is a more significant impact, and maybe we should be thinking about the kind of coordination problems, and are we able to have an impact by, say, taking different jobs, but in the kinds of numbers that we're talking currently, I don't think it's actually having significant impact yet, but maybe it's something that we should be thinking about. Yes?
So you talked a lot about kind of global impact and also in like having, like putting money places where it could be most good, and that's usually not in the US. And so I'm wondering how effective altruism and utilitarianism factor into what you see as your, like the way you act in your own communities or your responsibility here.
Yeah, I think I see that as somewhat similar to the question of how do you divide. Yeah, I think I see that as a question about how do you divide resources, and time is a resource, money is a resource, and similar to how we think about, in my family, we think about giving a significant chunk of our resources to the place where we think it's most effective, and then a significant chunk for our family and what we think is best for our family. I think likewise, both with money and with time, I think about having some division between things that are like optimized for impact, and then things that make me and my family feel connected and good. And some of that is volunteering or helping out or being friends with people in our own community, and donating to things in our community that we, services that we use, or a friend's fundraiser that is important to my friend and is important to my friendship with them. So that's the kind of thing that I think can be just part of a good social life, basically, is being active in your own community. But I think of that as part of our kind of community life rather than our impact. And I think people get confused about what they're going for, and I think separating out, like, what is this for? What's my goal here? Is important, in the same way that, like, my goals at work are different than my goals when I spend time with my children. And if I tried to like spend time with my children in a way that would help my work goals, or vice versa, like it just gets confused and you're not going to be good at any of your goals. So I think being clear about, yep, we have a variety of goals and we do different things in service of those different goals can be helpful.
Yeah, what metrics do we use to gauge
I guess I haven't like made up my own metrics for my impact. When, again, I think part of my path was like learning like, oh, this research is actually very hard. And it's hard to know what exactly the impact is, even in areas where there have been randomized controlled trials. You look at some of them were done during El Nino or something, and we're not really sure how much it generalizes to other times. So I think there are like kind of ranges where we think that, a lot of our donations have gone to mosquito nets, which is one of the most cost-effective ways to save lives because malaria is a serious problem still in a lot of places, and it is fairly easy to prevent. So we can kind of look at how much a net costs, what the sort of effectiveness estimates are on, this many nets can be expected to save a life. It's around $3,000 basically is expected to save a life, sort of on average. And so we can look at like the numbers of what impact we think that has had. It's still going to be a bit open to questions, but quick follow-up.
How would you decide between donating to the impoverished versus donating to organizations or museums that produce, preserve, and disseminate human knowledge?
If I thought we had a shortage of preserving, producing, and disseminating human knowledge compared to other things, then I would be concerned. So, for example, I think Wikipedia is great, but Wikipedia is also not going away. And if I thought that they were truly like funding constrained, then that's the kind of thing to say that I might support. But I don't think that's the case. I don't think they're neglected. Okay.
Could you speak to the diversity among the effective altruist community of gender, racial, economic backgrounds?
Yeah. That has also been an ongoing topic of like, wait, what is going on here? So basically, movement started by a bunch of white guys in English-speaking countries in their 20s. And a lot of it has continued in that vein. And part of what I aim to do in my community work is to help us break beyond that narrow demographic. I think if we are trying to improve the world, we can't just be white guys in our 20s in English-speaking countries with fancy degrees. I think we've made some progress. I think there's a long way to go. I think, for example, I said for a long time we were focused very much on like a narrow range of careers, and then we're starting to realize like, oh, there are all these different fields that we kind of need to coordinate with to have impact in these different areas, and we need people with experience in all these different areas, and that doesn't look like a bunch of people from the same kinds of few backgrounds. So I think that's one that a lot of people in EA really care about and are making slow progress on.
It seems like a lot of the things you talked about that effective altruists do are like individual choices, like within the constraints of the broader economic system. Would you say that there's a consensus like within the EA community about what an economic ideal would be and how to work toward that? Or is there like a multiplicity of views as to what kind of economic system we want?
I don't think there's a consensus. I think my friend Shen, who used to attend these talks and be an organizer at Yale, is one of the only socialist EAs that I know. But sort of it ranges from like overthrow the system to working in banking and everything in between. So I think I wouldn't say that like overthrow the system is a popular idea within EA or kind of like radical changes to the economic system. I think one thing that one influence that I see in EA is kind of looking at all these other altruistic projects that have gone terribly wrong in the past. And I count socialism as one of those. I may be getting astray. Like I think, say, social democracy like has a lot to offer, and I think there are like a lot of things that can be learned from different experiments. But I think one thing that you see in charity and in like all kinds of projects that people have undertaken is that there are like unexpected side effects and things don't go to plan, and well-intentioned projects can go terribly wrong. And so I think EAs tend to maybe have skepticism about radical change of a lot of different kinds because of like trying to learn from the mistakes of the past. But it's not at all a consistent thing.